So welcome to this latest webinar in what is a series, a new series. You'll be seeing more of these things coming in the not too distant future. I will tease you a little bit with one or two of the things that are coming in the autumn at the end. For this session, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Hughes, who is actually in my house at my dinner table over to my left. We've tested the audio. We don't think that there's going to be any overlap, but if there is, just tell us and we probably won't be able to do anything about it, but it'll be good to know. But we decided that it would make it easier for Mark, given technology constraints at his end, if we could do it in one space. So we are actually within a few feet of each other. So just a little bit of scene setting. This is what we're here to talk about, and I'll introduce both myself and Mark to those who don't know us shortly. But the format of today is as follows. We are recording for people who can't be here. If you wouldn't mind just having your mics off whilst me and Mark are doing the initial section of the session, and cameras on if possible. If you have got small children or CEOs or bosses walking behind you, or anybody that you don't want to be seen, then obviously turn them off. But cats and small children are actually cordially invited, so please bring all animals. Use chat if you want to lob questions in. I'll do my best to farm them as me and Mark chunter before we get to the group bit. And when it comes to the time, by all means raise your hands to make sure that we can farm the contributions accordingly. The scaffolding and the agenda, such as it is I'm going to talk to Mark for approximately 25 minutes just to till the soil of his experience and his experience of attempting to bust various myths in organizational change. Then we'll move into small groups, and then we'll have a kind of Q&A and plenary conversation. That's the plan for today. And just by way of a small warm-up, I found this quote, and I'll tell you where I got it from in a moment, but just have a read of that. And here's your starter for 10, your question. In the chat, please have your best guess for when this was written. And special bonus prizes for anybody who knows the author. The modern world is, above everything else, a world of rapid change. This is something which observers in every field of thought and knowledge are agreed. What does it mean? Many things, of course, but perhaps its primary meaning lies in its effect upon people, etc. When do you think that dates from? Ancient Greece, thanks, Toby. You're getting the drift of this. It was not quite as long ago, but it is from 1958. And it's from a book that Mark very kindly, when I went for a dog walk with him earlier this year, gave me his copy of this wonderful tome, which I'm looking forward to reading. And when I was skimming through it this morning before Mark came over, I was struck by just how much of it could have been written today and how much we seek to reinvent what we've known for a long time. So, by way of introductions, for those who don't know me, I'm Steve Hearson. I'm a consultant, a supervisor and a coach and a writer and a convener of conversations such as these. Most of my work is to do with leadership practice, to do with helping consultants and change practitioners sharpen their skills, and also culture work. And I'm going to kind of just stop it there. If you want to know anything more about me, feel free to stalk me on LinkedIn or elsewhere. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone, and hello again, Steve. Lovely to be talking to you. I'll have to use the R word. I'm retired and I'm getting used to that term, but I'm enjoying retirement. I worked between 1987 and 2019 as an academic, and my specialism was organizational change. My work was often provocative. I worked a lot with practitioners. It's how I got to know Steve. I had a cooler conversation in a workshop setting. So I'm enjoying resuming the conversation and just going back over some debates that fascinated me. So thank you for inviting me, Steve.
You're welcome. So I'm going to pin yourself and me, Mark, so that when people are watching, the video, they can see us for this bit. What Mark is too modest to say is that, in my estimation, and well, I know Mark through the network in Brighton, and I once explored doing a PhD with Mark and his colleague at the University of Brighton. But I remember being first hooked and curious about your work, Mark, when I read a paper of yours on the hope and despair continuum.
Mm.
And ever since then, I was aware of your thinking and your work. In more recent years, actually after you retired, I started to stumble across, before you dropped off LinkedIn, the odd thing that you'd posted. And for example, on what you've written about resistance to change and leading change, that just chimed with me and provoked my own thinking. And my own assessment is that you're one of the deepest and most usefully pokey thinkers and writers about organizational change of the last 20 odd years, which is why I'm delighted that you agreed to come out of your den over in along the coast here to have a conversation. So we call this myth understanding. And is it worth, Mark, just starting with why, when we start talking about this, you started talking about myth understanding and what this has to do with organizational change before we come to your three biggest?
Yes, thanks. As you can imagine, the spell checker every time wants to correct it to misunderstandings. I like that playfulness of interacting with the technology. I guess why I coined the term, and I still stand by the term, is there is a mythical element to all organizational change. My favorite quote was by Patrick Dawson when he talks about managing change is about moving from a known place to an unknown place. So everything we do in terms of change is about an unknown future. And I embrace that. We try and give it certainty with our models, theories, concepts, but nobody quite knows how a change is going to play out. So I wanted the term myth understanding to appreciate understanding, which is the cornerstone of universities and the knowledge offerings. But also I wanted to bring back into play the mythical aspect that I think is sometimes downplayed. So that gives you a flavour of where I was going with that.
From the conversation we had in the pub before we came here, and when we had lime and soda, by the
We
way, everybody,
did,
so they
yeah.
are going to make sense, I hope. I think we're finishing on a conversation around just how much myths are created to manage the anxiety of everybody from leaders through to practitioners and academics, which in a sense is the backdrop to our conversation, I suspect, Mark.
You've caught that beautifully, yes.
Thank you.
I I'm respectful of myths. They're put down as always being bad things, but I think when a new senior person takes over an organization, they're in the realms of the mythical, and to some extent, we need to acknowledge that.
Right.
So a lot of what we'll touch on today is about myth busting, and that's how I undertook my career. But the more I work with practitioners, and like you, I was doing many workshops out there in organizations, I began to respect that it wasn't quite the sort of knowledge type notions that sometimes universities sell as their offering. There was something else, a sort of theory practice interrelationship, and myths seem to build a bridge between those two worlds, which are often sadly remain separate. And yet your work and my work, I think, does try and bridge that chasm.
So let's then segue into the first of the myths, and which you describe as what was it? How you described it, Mark? Your tagline for the first one?
The myth that inspired me.
Yes, which was?
You asked for some sexy words, Steve. That's might being sexy. So it was around research informed teaching, and you might
Yeah.
think, well, what's he going on about that in an organizational change session? But this goes back quarter of a century. I was transitioning from being a paid researcher into being a full-time lecturer. And in all honesty, I was insecure. I wasn't quite sure what my offer was. So even back then, there was an appetite for research informed teaching. It was a sexy language as it is to this day. And I thought it'd be good just to look at some of the evidence supporting that belief. And then instrumentally, it would help my cause. So that was where I was going. And when I looked at the literature, it was a bit disappointing, actually. The closest I get is in top universities when they had done research. Some of the research active staff would say, well, it's the sort of atmosphere in our department. That's what the students get. And the sort of atmosphere is a bit of a fudge, really. It's quite difficult to make a link between a person doing research and then the experience of the undergraduate or postgraduate, how it'll be improved. So there was more to it in that chapter referenced in the flyer. I came up with 5 elements to that. But overall, it set the scene for the rest of my organizational change career in different ways. First, I quite like having the Mythbuster M on my chest. That made me feel quite good. And I sort of warmed to that identity. Secondly, I began to realize some of the most obvious things that we take for granted in our lives. Often there can be a mythical element to them, the myth understanding. So that was another insight. And also, I began to think about, yeah, I want to do more of this. This is quite intriguing. In particular, I had the pleasure of meeting a very famous professor. Sadly, he's dead now, but he was the father of a comedian in this country called Ben Elton. I don't know if anyone's heard of Ben Elton. He was very much in vogue back in the day. And Lewis Elton was his dad, and his big thing was scholarship. So what he was arguing for was in universities, we have teaching, research, and scholarship. Teaching is about disseminating existing knowledge. Research is about gathering new knowledge. And scholarship is about critically interpreting existing knowledge. And that for me was the eureka that set me off. I realized that I was trying to buttress my identity as a researcher, but I wanted to be a scholar. I wanted to look at knowledge and question it critically, and then that would be what I would bring to the workshops that I ran, and that is what ripples through all my books. So it was
So,
meeting Ben Elton's dad was where it all began.
so for where that kind of takes me is I want to check that I've understood this. There's a kind of humility to what you're saying, kind of an awareness of, whilst I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, I'm a scholar, and also I would imagine, because I know some of the work you did, you were a practitioner as well. What intrigues me, as you've transmogrified and your identity shifted, how did you experience, and were you experienced by those who you worked with in an academic institution?
Well, yeah, it's lovely, but I was only finding my feet in those days. My work got more, I don't know, it got more out there as I grew into the role. So in those early days, I was just coming out as a myth buster.
Okay, so
And
they hadn't quite spotted what they had on their hands.
no, what I'm saying is all the later pieces, if you know that nugget of information that I don't normally share, they make sense. So
Right.
a lot, I like to think a few of the sacred myths I did debunk over my career, but the
Yeah.
origin story is these moments where I was just trying to find myself as an academic, trying to establish my identity, realizing the seduction of myths and how prevalent they were, but how many academics want to play them down. They're very disparaging of them. Um, but to me, and if anyone read the chapter which I used to start off the textbook, I talk about going back to ancient philosophy, and myth was celebrated back in the day.
Right.
It's something a few hundred years ago when we had the Enlightenment, we began to go for logic and scientific knowledge. And I sometimes wonder romantically if we didn't lose something in the process. So, yeah.
So let's shift gear into possibly from our conversations, maybe the chewiest myth in that you've played with in the last few years, which arguably, I mean, you say yourself it's the myth that made you, but also not without some discomfort and arguably a bit of pain for you as part of the process.
Yes, so I was gathering confidence. I knew the trajectory I was on, but I wasn't fully secure in myself of what I was doing and how I was doing it. I was running workshops at venues like you were running, and practitioners, as they began to trust me, would say, "So Harvard Business Review inform us that change tends to fail. So isn't that a bit awkward in this 5-day residential workshop you're running?" To which I'd say, the banoffee pie is lovely, and we would move on. But yes, I felt I needed to explore what was going on there. And in a way, the template was what I'd done before. So I delved into it. So most of the people on the call will know, but Harvard Business School in 2000 came out with a paper which had a line in it. The brutal fact is that 70% of all change initiatives fail. To repeat that, the brutal fact is that 70% of all change initiatives fail. So you've got the words brutal, you've got the word fact, you've got a specific statistic. So this was so, so powerful. It framed introductions to textbooks, proposals, courses, the whole thing. And academics far, far more eminent than me were citing it and citing it in a way that suggested they trust it, not in an ironic way. So coming back to your question, it was difficult. I decided to look into the evidence, and there's none at all. There's absolutely no theory or literature. I'm not here to say change always succeeds. I've worked with enough practitioners to know it can fail atrociously on occasion, but you just can't generalize across all changes. It was madness what was being proposed. And so I challenged that. And I remember a very good friend, a professor at my institution, saying, look, don't do this, Mark. It won't be good for your career. It'll just upset people. And I had a doubt that perhaps I'll be honest here, I'd missed the evidence. I'd looked at 5 high-profile instances which seemed to support it and was able to totally knock them out the water. But I always felt there might be something in the background. So I submitted the paper. It was still, in terms of getting papers in journals, I was still on an evolution then. And I didn't quite know how it would play out. There's a special issue of the journal Change Management. And the special issue editor was a professor called Bernard Burns, who I got to know and work with subsequently. A beautiful man, so kind and passionate about organizational change. And so, yes, it was challenging.
So when we were talking before we came online, we got into a conversation about why that stat is so seductive and who benefits from that seduction.
Everyone, I think all of us here, in a way, benefit from it. So that's the great irony of what I was up to. So Michael Beer, who was one of the Harvard professors who wrote the article in HBR, he subsequently in the same year did a book with Nitin Naraya, who was then the dean of Harvard Business School. An interesting book, I must say, and I read it from cover to cover. And he talks about an unconscious collusion between 3 stakeholders. That's the academics, the consultants, and the managers or leaders, as they may be referred to today. So unconscious collusion between those 3 groups. So the reason that nonsense had been so prevalent and published in so many places up until that point was, for academics, they loved it. They would start their courses with it, their funding proposals, their textbooks. In my career, I was an author of organizational change textbooks, and you tend to look at the competition. And all of them would start with this 70% failure statistics. I wasn't making friends with them, was I? But the unconscious collusion, it was them. It was then the consultants. The consultants found it so, so useful. And some of you might have heard this. It's out there. They would be making a pitch and they would play to the fear factor. None of us want to be failures. I certainly don't. And if you're making a pitch and you start talking quite openly about, well, most of this fails. If you don't buy ABC's consultancy, you might too be one of those failures. So consultants lapped it up and used it a lot. And then the practitioners themselves in organizations, it gave strength. Solly's joined me. It gave strength. If he wants to stroke, we're becoming besties.
My dog's come to join the webinar, so just so you know, people.
The managers, the leaders, they welcomed it because it, as I say, it upped their authority, their currency in the workplace.
So what strikes me in what you're saying is there's a kind of a contradiction here, which is if the figure is true and 70% of all change projects fail, or however you construe that or you describe that, then um, it means that all this work that consultants are doing in selling their services has to be ineffectual. Because if they're selling their services, it's year after year after year on this basis, but nothing is getting better, what's happening?
Yeah, I don't know about that connection. I'm certain some of them were effective. What I didn't like, and I think you know me well, Steve. It's gone out of fashion. I'm quite a strong humanist, and I just didn't like the manipulative nature of it. But for all three parts, I didn't like the idea that I didn't like the idea that the consultants were using it to sell services. I didn't like that the academics were doing it to sell services, and equally with the managers, leaders. I just felt we've got to be honest and authentic, and to use a spurious, and it was spurious. There's no evidence whatsoever to back up 70%. They just made the number up. It sort of undermined a bit my belief in furthering knowledge and what we were doing. And I know what you're passionate about with No Silver Bullet. It's about trying to progress the world in a healthy way, and that was what spooked me. But I'm not questioning necessarily the effectiveness. I'm saying that the motivation for buying the services was questionable.
Yeah, I love Thomas's comment in the chat there, which is other people fail at 70%, but not my firm, so hire me. I think that goes to the heart of it.
It nicely, yeah.
Yeah, love that,
Thomas. Steve, I used to say workshops, and I did a lot of workshops. I would say to the group, and they were sort of in managerial roles, I would say, yeah, 70% fails, so you're successful, you need a pay rise, and I always got a laugh.
Yeah, and Jeff has dropped in a lovely McKinsey quote from McKinsey. We know, for example, that 70% of change programs failed to achieve their goals, largely due to employee resistance. Well, there we go. There's another huge myth, and lack of management support. Yeah, I mean,
it was all smoke and mirrors. Often when you delved in, they were trying to say things. Cotter came out with a subsequent book in 2008 called A Sense of Urgency, and he seems to say that 70% fail, but he was just touching on what had become like this belief. You know what I mean? So as long as you touch it in some way, you could then use that myth.
See, so the other bits we wanted to touch on, I think there was two things that interested me, which is one is authority. And the relationship, how that fits into the 70% failure story, and how that then segues into rhetoric and the history of rhetoric almost. Can you say a bit more about those?
Yeah, of course. So Harvard Business School was and still is the most famous business school in the world. It makes huge amounts of money delivering its services. It has the authority. I would have loved to have had some involvement other than critiquing Harvard, but I didn't. But if I had, I would have had far more authority. So most people, if they were asked Harvard professor or Mad Market who to believe, they've got that authority. So it needed to be them saying that change tends to fail. They needed to get that out because they weren't just influential in America. A lot of the business schools were drawing on Harvard as apparently the model to use. There's a whole story there, but I won't go there. Your neighbour's cutting the grass, Steve. I hope you could hear all right.
That's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
So authority is crucial in these debates. Whoever puts out the myth, if they've got authority, they're more likely to get away with it. So that's the first point. The second point, which I was sharing with you, is around the rhetoric. So a lot of my work, I was really interested in how language is used, how narratives are constructed, discourse analysis, all those sort of debates. And so rhetoric intrigued me. And I was mentioning to you, universities 100 years ago used to teach rhetoric. So this idea of these persuasive arguments, I think it's so crucial to understanding organizational change and organizational life. The bit I did disclose to you, and I can disclose today, the 2011 paper was published in Journal of Change Management, and the paper had to be double-blind reviewed. So the reason journal papers sometimes have more authority than a magazine article is two people review a paper and decide should it or shouldn't be published. in the case of the 2011 paper, something weird happened in that they sent it to the Harvard professor, Professor Michael Beer at Harvard Business School to review. Are you with me? So, Professor Beer reviewing my critique, and I'm sure many of you have seen the paper, um, and he chose to waive his anonymity. So he said, because I'm responding directly to you, I am that professor, and I'm 100% certain he was. And he came back with 2 pages of feedback. And when I looked at the feedback, I've got it here, I'll just give you the strengths. So this is coming from the Harvard professor when asked to review the paper. Okay. The author is justified in raising questions about the 70% failure rate that's been used by me and others. I think he's right that failure rates reported by Hammer and Champy were based on judgment rather than statistical precision. He's also right to conclude that 70% was then used, and this is the key bit, as a rhetorical device by me and others, and became a firm data point, which it is not. Um, so that's from the Harvard professor. And at that point, insecure Mark, who was still finding his way as an academic, thought, yeah, he's admitted to it. So I never put that in books or papers. But as I say, I've hung on to that quote for my own peace of mind as much as anything else.
So, whilst again, I think you'd be too modest to say it, you kindly shared with me that um, piece that he wrote, and what I feel I my observation is, and what I was struck by reading it is that he, on the one hand, acknowledges you were right, and on the other hand, his own discomfort at not being able to acknowledge that essentially you were right and possibly they were wrong means that he gets caught up in a kind of contradictory position. He cannot square it. But the thing I suppose that I'm left with is a thought that this is a fractal of a wider problem within scholarly and academic research and practitioner research, which is the inability to go, I think we could be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
It's
is this a parallel process? In the same way as that consultancies can't say, do you know what? Maybe some of our stuff doesn't work. Or academics can't say, well, sometimes I could have been wrong.
Yeah, it's so true. And no, so but you get into that face saving and how crucial it is in organizational context. And when my paper was published, I embarrassed quite a few professors who had asserted it in referee journal papers, which had been through a double-blind review process. And here was little Mark popping his head up, not an authoritative figure. I concede that, but saying, wait a minute, there's nothing here. I think you might have used the emperor's clothes, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The emperor's
But
naked.
but I think what you've just said says something with you. I get your humility, which is, little Mark popping his head up, but your humility, you're almost kind of pointing out the absurdity of the professorial figures in some contexts. Anne-Marie's put a lovely quote in the chat, or a comment in the chat, which is, quote, it is far from modern professors that largely deny anything that might cause them to lose brand resonance, unquote.
Mm,
So you are a writer, a scholar, an academic who, you embody the I think this, but I don't know-ness.
yeah, that would
I
be
think
fair.
I'm right, but tell me if I'm wrong.
No,
And
the point you made earlier is so important. It's very difficult for an academic to say that stuff I wrote last year is all wrong. It's a very difficult thing to do. Yeah.
right. And so the parallel process is me as predominantly a practitioner researcher, and I think you probably identify more as a researcher practitioner. I'm putting words in your mouth, but I guess that's where our similarities and differences lie. The practice side, we're then into the fragility of the practitioner, which is how many of us, including those on this sitting listening here, when we are faced with not knowing or the possibility that what we believe we know is not true, are able to go, oh, I could be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I would do workshops in organizations at quite a senior level, but not at the most senior level. Practitioners would buy into my argument why the figure was flawed. They would then go into a meeting with their people above them who would quote statistic, and we would collude, me and those from the workshop, that it was best not to say to your boss, you're talking nonsense. You get it. So I think it's the point you're making. It becomes very difficult to challenge some of these myths. They're so powerful. and powerful in both senses of the word. You know, they're embedded with power. Yeah.
So again, some lovely things in the chat here. I'm going to pick up another one from Amory, who says we used to call that integrity. Mark, you have a great deal of it. It's hard to be an academic with a high level of integrity. Um, but I wonder whether or not that integrity question ripples a bit beyond the hallowed halls of some institutions into whether it be consulting practice or C-suite, that we struggle with integrity as human beings more than we think we do. One of the things you said in our brief chat over lunch was a conversation you'd had with a consultant from one of the big four. That just comes to mind here in the context of integrity. What was it you said to me, Mark? They said about
Well,
fear?
in fairness, he was from an independent consultancy,
Right,
but he had worked for one of the big
right.
four. And I'd done the pitch on the 70% failure rate out in Belfast, of all places. It had gone down really well. And we're flying back to the airport. And he said, yeah, I agree with you. When we went in and pitched to clients, we were always told to instill fear in the client and then to make the pitch. And we had to, excuse me, I'm not getting emotive, it's the hot weather. We had to instill the fear. And I think that's the part of the failure success debate that's intrigued me. It's not neutral, it's about instilling fear in people in the workplace. And again, I find that very manipulative.
Which I think is a good point to shift into the myth that broke you,
Yeah.
um, which is having thrown, I don't know how big the rock or the pebble was of your paper about 70% of change projects failing, that not being true. You then started to rub up against this shift from managing change to leading change.
Yeah.
And that, and the more I reflected on that between about an hour and a half ago when we first started talking about it into now, what I've noticed in me is a growing irritation. And I kind of, and what, when I said to you, but this is basically just heroic leadership being reskinned and represented in a different form, and you just looked at me and grinned. Um,
Sorry. Thank you for that feedback.
in a very knowing way, kind of saying you caught up with me, Steve. And and yeah, just share a bit more about that, because I think that was not. It's not that it was new to me, Mark, but it kind of something shifted in the gears in my brain as I was thinking about the difference between managing change and leading change, and the argument you make there.
Yeah, yes. So remember the dates when I started and left academia. 1987, I became an academic. 2019, I left academia. So 32 years, interesting, enjoyable years. When I set out, everyone was going to manage change. Managing change was the sexy thing on the circuit. It was always going to be successful. There wasn't an assumption it would ever fail. So that started, and then there became these questions, these queries about it failing. And then we moved towards leadership in particular. There was this huge upsurge in interest in developing leaders and leadership, the heroic leadership amongst them. And in particular, for my purpose, there was an interest in leading change. So what I'm saying is, by default rather than design, all of that debate played out over my academic career. I had this moment in the middle of the last decade where I thought to myself, why did we shift from enthusiasm for managing change to enthusiasm for leading change? It was such a huge shift, profound implications for all organizations across the world. This wasn't a localized thing. The amount of money involved, the amount of emotion invested in that. And so I set out to find out why that had happened, and it's referenced in the flyer in the 2016 book. I didn't do a systematic review, but I looked over 35 years in a way at how that had happened. I started with a beautiful book by James McGregor Burns, where he did a book on leadership, which is seen as one of the milestones. And in it, back then, he talked about leadership as suffering from intellectual mediocrity. So I thought that was a lovely milestone to start from. And then I went on a critical review. And the reason that was the myth that broke me was the learning was powerful, but it was also difficult to sell to anyone else in the world. So that's why it broke me. I warmed to another scholar who was coming up with similar conclusions, Bert Spector, in his critical analysis of leadership, when he said there's a danger of that idealized concepts have become empirical or perceived as empirical realities. Idealized concepts perceived as empirical realities. And sorry, I've gone on a bit there, but my headline learning was there wasn't the knowledge, substantive knowledge to support any shift from managing change to leading change. Leading change might be better for organizations, society, everyone. But what I'm saying is the offer that it was underpinned by a sort of vein of deep knowledge. I wasn't personally convinced, although I should say that is such an unorthodox view. That was what broke me. I couldn't maintain that position.
Well, the words you used in the note you gave me was change management had to be predominantly and publicly be depicted as failing if leading change was to succeed. And it's
Yeah,
the binary that set up there that is intriguing, which is it was not possible for leading change as a new entity to march over the hilltops and coexist alongside managing change, where they could be both regarded as having utility.
brilliant. You've got it. And so many people out there didn't seem to get that. But that's what I believe. And a few years since, and as you know, I've been roaming around in the countryside. I still believe that. Just to nail it for you. Harvard Business Review, and remember, it's a magazine. It wasn't refereed in any way. It's the House magazine of Harvard Business School. Came out with three articles. One in 2000, Why Corporate Changes Fail by Beer et al. One in, let's get this right. Sorry, not 2000, 1990 was the beer paper. 1996 was Cotter. I think everyone here has probably heard of the paper there, Leading Change, Why Transformation Efforts Fail. And then the third one Harvard put out was 2000, and it's the brutal fact that 70% of change fails. So you've got three authoritative papers published in Harvard Business School, and they seem to frame this idea that change tends to fail. Are you with me?
Mhm.
That was the takeaway. But when I began to go on my little journey into this whole mythology, when I read each of those articles, and top academics don't touch them anymore, they're seen as dodgy work, to be honest. But when I looked into them, I found they weren't depicting change and transformation as failing. And if you think about it, Harvard Business School was never going to do that because that was how it made its money. So it must have been doing something more subtly. But most people took the headline that change and transformation tends to fail. What they were
So there's
doing was saying managing change fails, but by implication, the bright new shiny thing, leading change, it's going to succeed.
So lovely little exchange on the chat. So John says, so what were the material changes between managing change and leading change, and how much of that was just um, a linguistic change? And Thomas's follow-up, referencing Cotter. Cotter claims that um, managing is about sweating details and leading is about bravery.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And when we had that nice lunch nearby, I began to unpack this, and there's so much out there. I, I'll just, I won't come to the sex. The problem is you can get caught up in the definitions, and I was very clear on the definitions. But what I did do was historiography. So I went over the history, and what I found was Zalznek came out in a paper differentiating leadership from management in Harvard Business Review, and I found that useful. He was citing there Rockefeller, an American billionaire, saying we need to shift to leadership. I then encountered in the Wall Street Journal, they were publishing one-page adverts saying, let's get rid of management. And then the third time was a Cotter book, his 88 one, where Perot, like the Elon Musk of today, was saying we need a shift to leadership. So what was going on there was American businesses really struggled. We see the tension with China now, but back in the day when these Harvard professors were writing, it was the problem was Japan actually. The car industry was decimated by Japanese manufacturing, and American businesses were in a perilous state, and they blamed it on management. They saw leadership as an alternative. They could invest hope and enthusiasm for the future in that. So they had to disparage management to give impetus to leadership. And as I say, you won't get taught this in any business school. Even as I say it now, I can hear my madness, but I stick to my madness.
So, on the note of sticking to your madness, Mark, there's a nice way to maybe shift into getting people into some small groups to have some conversations before we come back for questions and a bit of chat. But you, I think, are quite fond of the Gabriel quote from 1991.
Yeah, so
Maybe as a way to end this part of our conversation.
yeah, thank you for the reference to humility, and somebody else mentioned it, and I strive for that in later life. I remember turning to a professor and saying, I'm practicing a program of humility. And this professor was a good friend, and he said, no place for humility at a university, which I thought was so, so beautiful. But the irony, and some might know about it or not know about it, was in the end, in one of our most prestigious social science journal, there are repeated claims that organizational change tends to fail. And the reference that supports that now is Mark Hughes, 2011. So at the end of this, and it was a really enjoyable journey. I'm not here to whinge. I enjoyed the journey. But having thought I got that myth on my chest and I was the myth buster, it turned out the myth sucked me into it, framed me as its main proponent, and then expelled me. And if anyone read the myth understanding chapter, it ends with a quote from a wonderful professor, Yanis Gabriel, where he said, "It's easier to slay a dragon than to kill a myth."
So, on that dragon-laden note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set some groups up so you can have some conversations, if that is okay. So I'll put you in groups of around about 4. Mark, you'll get invited to one, but don't feel you have to join, but it will automatically.
I'll chill a bit.
You can chill a bit because you'll probably want to just lie down in a darkened room now. So the rooms. No, why is that not doing that? How many of you are there? About 10 rooms, I reckon. Let's see. That's about right. Okay. So you're in 3s and 4s, I think. That should be about right. And I'll give you about 20 minutes, unless you send me a message screaming saying you want more time and you're having too much fun and you don't want to come back and see anybody else. Any questions before I open them? No? Okay, rooms are opening now. So welcome back. We'll have people coming in over the next minute. I'm assuming that you ran quickly back from your room because you were having a big fight or something.
No, it just it kicked me out. Promise, Gav. I was actually mid sharing a link, but
yeah, I pressed that button too quickly. I didn't realize that was pull the parachute, that button.
Oh, Ham's just got your message in the chat. No worries. Glad you're still with us. Right. And everyone is back. So welcome back. Is that everybody? Yes, I think you've all been teleported by Zoom back into the main room. So this really is the remaining time we've got is for us just to till the soil of your conversations and however you want to involve me, but particularly Mark in the inquiry. So I guess just use the sticking your hands up thing or throw a cat at the screen if you want to say something. And yeah, either what's been going on in your conversations in the small groups that is worth bringing to this forum, or equally if you have any questions or reflections for Mark and myself. Where would you like to go? Thomas has put a question in the chat. Biggest takeaway from each breakout? We could go there.
Maybe Hillary can say something on behalf of the group I'm in.
Yeah, so it's Arnie, Chris, and I had a nice chat. We shared things from different perspectives. We even talked about bus terminals. Not quite sure how that came about, but it did. Pleasure speaking with you.
So bus terminals from that group, excellent. I'm loving it. Doesn't surprise me with you in the group, Hillary. So I just want that to be known. So
no, Steve, we are talking about bus terminal. I was actually about to explain. In change management, there are two kind of things that you need to do. One is at program level, one is at project level. Project level is more grounded, right? The project level is supposed to produce the output. Without the output, nothing can be spoken, okay? Whereas program is managing the multiple projects, putting it together. But all I'm saying that in order, when we do change program, it's always at the end of the day, it must benefit the stakeholders, right? Whether the employees, the suppliers, the investors. So they were looking for what we call the WIFM, what is it for me thingy, right? So I was highlighting to my group about the bus terminal where, put all the buses. The contractor who did that bus project, actually they are just doing a project. Their job is only to complete the bus terminal. But if the bus terminal is not being used by many and there's no benefit to it, actually the entire program fail.
yeah.
The entire
So
program fail.
what's the primary task?
So the primary task of any change effort is actually to make sure that there is an outcome from the effort. So in other words,
which I think is interesting, Izani, because I'd agree with you. I think the challenge is that some change initiatives, the primary task is lost in the anxiety of the people who are commissioning the work, and what they think is the primary task is not. It's an avoidance of.
Yes,
it's the primary risk they're managing. Lovely. Thanks, Izani and Hiri. So nice couple of questions in the chat. So John, we talked about how we were all culpable in allowing myths to endure, but also how some of them were actually helpful. Change may not fail 70% of the time, but it's hard, and the myth helps reinforce that. Well, that's a nice subtlety. I quite like that. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I'm totally there. My myth understanding was trying to build a bridge rather than just get rid of the myths and soldier on, just looking for the understanding that we need to acknowledge the two sides to it. And as I said earlier, when an incoming person is initiating a big change transformation initiative, there is a mythical element where everyone does need to believe in that. If they don't, they haven't got a chance. And equally, as was mentioned, to go into that knowingly, and we were talking over lunch about the power of being reflexively as well, I think is a helpful position. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to throw in another myth, I've been having some interesting conversations with Niels Fleeging, who some of you may know as a German management consultant, and he recently published something about the myth of acceptance in the context of change. That there is you hear this in Kotter's work, the need that everybody has to be on board, that everybody has to accept change at some level before it's deemed that one can start. And I just wondered, Mark, whether you had any thoughts on that as an idea. I know I'm throwing that to you kind of fresh.
I always have thoughts on change, Steve. But you touch upon it in No Silver Bullet, and I do in my textbook in particular. The myths around overcoming resistance to change. When you go back to the first instance of that terminology, Koch and French, when actually saying it's about overcoming resistance to change, they were talking about participation, and the changes that worked well were the ones where there was participation. Now, linking that in with acceptance, there's a literature that I'd like to have a stronger currency out there on change readiness, and in particular Armenakis and Harris, where they talked about how well your change plays out depends a bit on the readiness, and they break it down into 5 elements. And to me, that would segue into your acceptance. it's more difficult to make a change happen in an organization where there isn't a level of change readiness. But as I say, in my working life, I didn't hear enough being said and written about change readiness. If anyone's interested, Armanakis and Harris did an overview of their work, and it's a freely downloadable paper from the Journal of Change Management in the Reflection series. So well worth a look for anyone.
What I might do is, Mark, is I'll capture that off you when we finish, and I'll put it into the email to you all when I send out the link to the recording and the follow up. So I'll make sure you get that. Jeff, lovely comment for you, Mark. He says, Mark, are you sure you were an academic? You don't sound like one to me. Far too humble and honest. How did you escape the virus? I think the answer to that, Mark, is the South Downs needed walking. Isn't that the answer?
Yeah. What's interesting, Steve, I've admitted I love change. I was fascinated by it, but I'm hopeless at technological change. And all I saw at the bottom of the screen was, "Are you sure you are an academic?" So thank you for reading the rest of it out. I just thought, that's a bit harsh. I've come here and shared my stuff. But thank you for clarifying that. I might have got away with a misapprehension.
Lovely. One from Alison. We were curious around what is the macro myth that supports and sustains the work of leadership development, OD, management development, that we, messy, chaotic, emotional, subjective, and self-authored and orientated beings will be less messy, chaotic, and emotional and work nicely with each other.
Wow.
There we go. That's on a hot afternoon. Thanks for that, Alison. That'll make our brains go bang. I like that.
I suppose it's just, I maybe I am just overheating, but I sometimes catch myself wondering if there's a whole architecture or a whole mythology actually that I am part of, but seems to do the crazy dance we do as humans at work, and I've just kind of come to accept it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I go to a kind of existentialist place with that, which is that there's the need for certainty, and that we have a need to know, and the opposite of that is being comfortable with not knowing and going, that doesn't make sense. So the macro myth is maybe that there is an answer, and that we do know, and that we should know, and if we seek long and hard enough, we will find a way to know. Thomas, you've thrown your hand up in response to something there.
Well, in our breakout, we talked a bit about what it is that seems to make change work and not work. And what I offered that didn't get too much pushback, so maybe this group can put me properly in my place. I would claim that there's two major ways in which we face the challenge of change. One is through hope and love, and the other is through anger and fear. And as soon as anybody in the power structure above you starts to show signs of anger or fear, the smart thing to do is shut down and cover your ass. And because anger and fear above you immediately puts a sword right over your addiction to food, clothing, and shelter. You know, I need my job, you know, and if my people above me are like calm and empathic, and maybe they're facing a terrible struggle, but they do it in a kind of a curious, you know, this is a mess. When we're on the other side of this, we're going to be amazing, because we're going to face this so wonderfully. I can't wait to see who we have to grow into to face this challenge. Isn't this going to be awesome? Let's do it together. Like, that's like, wow, okay. I'm being my best self. I'm calm. I'm curious. I'm empathic. I'll join that. But you get anybody in the chain of command above you starts to do the opposite. The amygdala, rather than the whatever the part of the brain is that gives us our empathy. You know, you start shrinking and contracting and getting, I got to rush to the first answer that I can find because I'm so uncomfortable with not knowing. Well, that's not calm or curious or empathic. That's the other thing. And these two dominant modes, from what little I know about neuropsychology, they're not that they're in combat, but one suppresses the other. So if you're actively scared, all that calmness and curiosity and empathy vanish. And if you can manage to get your calmness and curiosity and empathy active, then you calm down and you stop being so driven by your fear and your anger.
I think there's something quite...
That's like, I'll change with the calm, curious person, but I will hide and resist from that other person.
I think there's something that we we tend to skip over there, Thomas, which I like what you're saying. I remember once meeting a head teacher from down here in the southeast who would do talks at teacher conferences and head teacher conferences. And he once told me that he primed 2 people in the audience. He said, I'm going to ask you if you're going to volunteer in a moment. I'm going to ask the volunteers because I want to teach the audience how to do jive and swing dancing. And he picked 2 people who he knew were game for something. And so they said, yeah, sure, we'll say yes. And when it came to saying to the audience, right, I'm going to teach you all to do a couple of dance moves. And the fear and the anxiety in the room rocketed. And he got his 2 volunteers up on stage and he showed a couple of moves to the audience. And then he stopped and he turned to the audience. He said, so how much of the last 5 minutes have you actually heard? How are you feeling? And the point he was making to them was, how useful is it to instill fear in your students? And if you translate that into an organizational context in terms of what we do with power and authority and command, forms of leadership, there's the fractal, or there's the parallel process. So I think you're right, Thomas. It's kind of like a truism, but actually there's more weight to it maybe than we give it.
Yeah, and there's an addictive nature to, there are actual things to be scared of, like the world is not a benign place necessarily. And when if I have to lean into fear even a little bit and I watch people actually move faster as a result of being scared, it's like, oh, that was addictive. Yeah. And then I'm frustrated. No one seems to be moving. So I lean into the fear again. Oh, look, they moved again. Yeah. And then it becomes this tempting, self-perpetuating style. Mark's got his hand up.
Mark, go for it.
Yes, it is hard. And I've been processing Thomas and Alison's questions. And I do want to say a few words. Go like that if I'm talking too much, though, Steve, because I have been talking all afternoon. But I mentioned James McGregor Burns in his book, was simply called Leadership, 1978. And to some leadership scholars, it's seen as the classic work. He offered a form of transformational leadership, which had some resonance with what Thomas was talking about. And I think that macro debate Alison was getting at. He wasn't talking about the change and transformation that we're been talking about today. He was a political scientist. He was interested in the transformation of societies by more democratic, less fear-based models. So 1978, the classic book. What then happened was Bass took on his work and brought it into an organizational context and took out all that democracy, all that good stuff, and build something that was called transformational leadership, which is still preached and practiced in organizations and universities to this day. So a lot of the human stuff was edited out of the original conceptualization of transformational leadership. And that is so often missed. The other part of that 35-year review, and remember, I was somebody who wasn't a leadership scholar. I was fascinated by why was leading change coming into vogue. And so I had to become a leadership scholar. So I was almost reading naively. The other author I came across who did an overview, again, an American, was J.C. Rost. And he did a wonderful book about leadership, where he made a case for leadership being about being participative and consultative. And the only way anything was going to happen wasn't by the fear, the anger, the just do it, or with an F word in our country in there. It was about, let's work together, let's make things happen. His work, he got the Leadership Achievement Award, I think, in 2008 from memory. And yet most business schools won't touch his work because it offers a vision that doesn't play into the macro version of, as we talked about over lunch, the heroic leader who's going to save the world.
And I think we also just need to own it as well. For many of us on this today are from the practitioner side of the fence. But I don't think we talk enough about the heroic practitioner or the heroic consultant. That sits in our shadow. I mean, I can feel that in myself. It happens every time a client says to me in any shape or form, "You're an expert in," to which my normal response is to giggle internally and go, "No, not really. I know some stuff. I have some questions, but what are you setting me up for here?" But there's our part of this, and I wonder whether or not this is just an in the moment reflection. Whether there's much in the literature, Mark, that actually pays attention to that shadow side of practice. There is much that's written about leadership, and we've got in your work the shadow side of organizational change and what's not being paid attention to. but how much is there that really acknowledges the shadow side of consulting and change practice? Owns it?
Yeah. I'm just looking at my notes. I reread Hughes' Mythbusting chapter, and that's why I'm looking at my aid memoir. And I set up two dichotomies in the first couple of pages in that. One is thought versus action, and the other is theory versus practice. And I'm not in almost like you're not in a good place to answer your own question, Steve. And in a way, I'm not. Universities believed that they were at the forefront of thought and theory, but the downside of that was they were very dismissive of action and practice. It was almost, although they earned their livings off that world, they weren't as respectful of that world. I don't know what the term for it is. I did so many workshops that I went over to being more aligned with those practitioners than many of my academic contemporaries. There were some good ones out there. I don't want to generalize, but um, so as I say, I'm a bit biased. Um, yeah. Do you mean heroic practitioner as critically or positively? Because you could read that in two ways.
I view it as critically if the heroism is one that denies what's not working and what might not be.
I get it. Yeah, I think there's always a danger of that. And when I look back over the 32 years that I worked as an academic, part of my problem was the early literature, and you will have reviewed some of this for No Silver Bullet, was, if I can get the word out, heliographies, where it was the senior person had transformed their organization and they wrote 300 pages on how they'd done it. And there was no mention of, there must have been other people in that very large organization. So there was a lot of that literature. There was a lot of practitioner guidance, which wasn't really rooted in anything. It was more rooted in ego, if I'm being very critical. And so what happened for me when I sort of began to find this identity as an organizational change scholar, most academics saw that world as being inhabited by those books and articles and nonsense, really. So, yes, there was a lot of that about, and it did a lot of damage to the status of organizational change as a field of study, because it still is to some academics not as prestigious as some of their other fields. And I really don't want to go there. But yeah, there was an element of that. But I think why I'm fighting against it, Steve, and I know you've done this, I've run workshops with people and I've just come away with a huge amount of admiration for them. They were living through change initiatives where it was challenging. They were doing it, in somebody used the word integrity earlier, in a really decent way. And they were up against all sorts of challenges. And I think the phrase I was thinking of is Stockhausen syndrome. I sort of joined them and their world, and I thought some of the academics who preached ethics, I don't think they really understood what the word meant. But yeah, I can say it to a practitioner forum, can't I?
But it's interesting, and as we kind of come to a close, it was interesting conversations you and I were having, Mark, and I think it's worth just saying this to you as a group. It was fascinating hearing you, Mark, kind of being reassured almost that this is a predominantly practitioner gathering. When we looked at the guest list or the people who signed up, and your trepidation at what would happen if you'd have looked down and seen various professors or senior lecturers in from academic institutions, and there's almost no response needed. It's more your emotional response to that says something.
Yeah. Yeah, fair comment. But at the beginning, you didn't mention where you lived, did you?
No. So, Mark, if I said to you, what's your, you've kind of come out of your lovely den over down the coast, as you said to me repeatedly, you're not really practicing anymore. You don't really read stuff anymore. This was something for you that you felt engaged to do. But in the spirit of that, what are you left with as a wondering or as a provocation or as a thought as you finish this nigh an hour and a half of chewing on this stuff?
Yeah.
If anything.
No, it's fair, Steve. Our paths crossed last year, and you suggested it might be good to talk, and then we met up and we talked, and I've enjoyed the conversation. I also attended the book launch for No Silver Bullet online, and I can share this with you now. I was in one of these breakout sessions, and I didn't expect it. I felt to myself, I'm finding this quite interesting. I was just there to cheer Steve along. I knew how much emotion and energy you put into working on the book, and I just wanted to be there. But as I say, I felt I haven't quite let go of this stuff. Um, I can share with everyone that I needed to get out of academia for positive as well as the negative reasons. I needed to live a bit of life. It's a lovely place to hide, is academia. The ivory tower metaphor really works. So I needed to get out, and as you say, I'm very open. I no longer read the literature I used to love reading. I no longer write, and I used to really love writing. But I wasn't sure how I'd feel about today. And as I went back over my stuff, I realized I still have a fondness, a passion for this field of theory and practice. And I'm building up to a final sentence, Steve. It's coming. You know, an academic. But the final thing I'll share is I have enjoyed today, and thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, on a really hot heat wave for joining us. The thing that I used to mention with practitioners in workshops was I'm not very good at change. I really struggle with change. I can say that now. And so my driver for studying it so deeply was that I wanted to try and make things a bit better for those in organizations so that I knew that there was better ways of changing and facilitating that. And I've enjoyed doing that. And I think that's the sort of touchstone that came back to me today. There's been a nice rapport, nice debate. And so thank you so much.
Lovely. So by way of finishing off, those who want to find Mark's stuff, this is his website, which, as well as wonderful reflections on life and change and transformations at a deeply human level, there's also a good repository that Mark's created of some of his key works and jumping off points to all of his texts. So if you do want to dive into Mark's stuff, that's as good a place as any to start. And Google Scholar actually has quite a good summary of all of Mark's work as well. So do a search there. Just a little heads up, what's next? September on the 10th, I'm running something with Jeremy Keeley on where do we draw the line? What's too far? How do we know? Who decides? And that's very much from a kind of practice and change point of view. In October, I'm plotting, but November, I finally found a CEO, a current in-post CEO who's willing to talk about their experience of shame in their role, but also shame in the C-suite. And that is going to hopefully be firmed up soon, and there's more to come. Plus, there'll be some in-person events in London, including one around for practitioners around what happens when the fragility of the client meets that of the practitioner. And if you want to keep track of when I'm doing stuff, then by all means sign up to my newsletter. It comes out sporadically when I have something to say rather than by rote because I feel I have to stick to a schedule. So by all means, feel free to sign up to that. Other than that, thank you all for coming. Have we hit look at that, 15:30. Oh, look at that. Right on the dot. Thank you all for coming. I will send out the slides and a link to the recording once I've processed it. Apologies for the dog interrupting Mark when he was talking clever stuff. And look forward to seeing you all again at some point in the future. Been a delight. There we go. And let's just get rid of that one.
It's like a ballet, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, there we go. Right, we can come off now.
Excellent.